This morning we will be looking at the opportunities of the Christian church as we work our way through our SWOT analysis that we've been looking at. For those who may not remember or haven't been here, this is simply a tool that we can use to identify the strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and threats that any kind of organization faces. And the first 2 weeks, last 2 weeks I should say, we looked at the S, which is the strengths, and the W, the weaknesses. So that brings us up to the O for opportunities. And the little diagram on the screen just shows that the first two is set up this way, that the strengths and weaknesses are what currently is the case or the situation in an organization, but also then we look at what the future holds or what we plan for the future in the form of opportunities, which are the strengths of the future, and then the threats will be the weaknesses in the future. So what are our opportunities in the future? These are the ways that the Christian church can improve its standing and thrive in the future. And as I mentioned in the other weeks, this message is not specifically directed at the situation of this specific church, but I'm looking at the Christian church as a whole. Take Walmart, for instance. If they were making one of these analyses for their company, they have many, many opportunities. But I would suggest that near the top of Walmart's list of opportunities is they have the wherewithal and the cash most likely built up in the bank to invest in building more stores. That way they can reach more customers. It's just one of many opportunities that they have. Now, for the Christian church, we don't always have all this money in the bank to build new churches, and sometimes we're building new churches when the current churches aren't being filled anyway. That's another issue for another time. But just like the strengths and weaknesses that we looked at over the past couple weeks, you can't pick just one. There's not just one opportunity for the Christian church, but the opportunity that we will look at this morning concerns new believers. And if you remember what we talked about, what was the mission statement of the church that we find in the Bible is the Great Commission. And it's in Matthew 28. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all the things that I have commanded you. It is helpful when we think of the Great Commission to get an inside look at how believers react to the gospel so that we can then do our part to facilitate this process and make and keep disciples. We'll look at the parable of the sower today. This parable is recounted in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When I compared the passages, the wording is very, very similar, so I picked the first one. I went with Matthew's telling. And the interesting thing about the setting of this parable, when Jesus was telling this story to the crowds, is that so many people came out to hear Jesus on that day that he felt it was best to get in a boat on the Sea of Galilee and push out a little into the sea. That way he could speak to the multitudes and they could hear him better. And this is where we hear Jesus telling the crowd this parable. And again, we find it in Matthew 13, and I'll be reading the first 9 verses first, which is the actual parable, and then we'll look at Jesus' explanation shortly. But reading from the word of the Lord, it says, On the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up, because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Then in the next 8 verses in Matthew 13, we read how the disciples ask Jesus privately why he speaks in parables, and he gives them an explanation for that. And by the time we reach verse 18 in that same chapter, the massive crowd had now dispersed, and Jesus tells the meaning of the parable just to the disciples. And we read that beginning in verse 18 through verse 23. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. Now he who received the word, or receives seed among the thorns, is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. And the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of his holy word. Amen. Going with the theme of opportunities for the Christian church, we're trying to make some sense of how people come to faith in Jesus Christ. The parable describes 4 situations where the sower scatters seed, and in each situation, the sower and the seed are the constant in each situation. The only difference between them is the soil. Jesus tells in the parable why each type either accepts or rejects the seed. So, as we are looking for insight into opportunities for the church, there's an awful lot to learn from this parable. Take the first situation that Jesus describes in verse 4, where he says, some seed fell by the wayside and the birds came and devoured them. And Jesus tells us that means when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. Well, the wicked one is none other than the devil. What the Bible tells us to do when we are confronted with the devil, we see in James chapter 4, verse 7. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We aren't really called in the Bible to engage the devil in combat. We are just called to resist him. Now, it may sound easy to resist him, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Especially when there are new believers in the faith. We have to teach them the realities of the spiritual realm around us. Based on recent studies, many Christians don't even believe that the devil exists. And many of those that do believe he exists think of him as just some kind of a spiritual force rather than a real live being. And it's one of the most ironic things ever, because Satan tells the world that he doesn't exist. And those who are too smart for that, he tells he isn't what the Bible says he is. Well, if you look in the Bible, in Genesis, Satan appeared as a serpent. In the wilderness, he appeared with Jesus as a man tempting him. And in Revelation, he's a full-blown dragon bent on world domination. This is a lot more than some kind of vague spiritual force. This is someone who has marshaled his army of demons to help oppose the work of God. And he begins with attacking God's people and those who are drawn to God. But the good news is there is a way to guard against the attacks of Satan, but we can't guard against him if we cling to an inaccurate vision of who the enemy is. This is why the reality of who the devil is must be preached and taught. The odds are pretty good that sooner or later you're going to come across someone who thinks you're silly for believing in a guy wearing a red suit, holding a pitchfork, and having a tail. Well, that's not the devil anyway, but don't let that faze you, because the Bible clearly tells us that your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. This is why brand new believers can't be just left out there to figure out this new Christian thing that has happened to their lives. Believers must be taught about the Father that they serve, the enemy that they oppose, and be supported prayerfully by mature believers in the church. I can't emphasize how important it is to be supportive of new believers, because we don't want these believers to become like the seed that fell on stony places. As it says, they didn't have much earth, and they immediately sprang up, but when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Which Jesus explains, this is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. These believers are a great opportunity for the Christian church, but since we learn from the Bible that the believer must establish a firm root in the faith, we must be prepared to withstand persecution. Otherwise, they will certainly stumble in the faith. The great philosopher Homer Simpson once said, "Trying is the first step towards failure." Well, Homer's actually not a great mind, but the worst thing that you can do for a new believer is to set them up for failure by promising that if they come to Jesus, their life's going to be a walk in the park. There were 4 good friends, lifelong friends, and sadly one of them was not expected to live long. So he gave 3 of his friends, one a church deacon, one a doctor, and one a lawyer, an envelope each with $25,000 in cash. And he told them this is one last way that they can prove their friendship to him. He said, "If you're truly my friend, you'll place this envelope with the money in it in my casket." Well, shortly thereafter, he does pass away. And at the viewing, each of his friends puts the envelope in the casket. Months later, the 3 remaining friends get together for lunch, and the subject of the envelopes comes up. And the deacon says, "I got to confess that I did not put all $25,000 in. I donated $5,000 to a missionary cause at my church and put the remainder in the envelope and in the casket." Doctor says, "Don't worry," he says, "I did something similar. I donated $10,000 to a children's hospital and put the remainder in the casket." And the third one was a lawyer, and he looks in disgust at his two friends, and he says, I can't believe you two would do such a thing. I put a personal check for $25,000 in my envelope and put it in the casket. The point is, we need to be very careful about the things that we promise. The truth is that most likely life will not be easy, especially if you are a Christian. Consider Jesus' words in Luke 9. If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. There are rewards promised for us in heaven, not on earth. Therefore, we should not expect God to shower us with all sorts of material riches once we become Christians. And to preach such a thing would be pastoral malpractice, if I can coin such a phrase now. Actually, the very opposite of that is true. And I submit to you the words of Jesus in Luke about taking up your cross daily. What is that? Well, maybe it's freely admitting that Jesus is Lord. Maybe it's being passed up for a promotion at work because you're a Christian. Maybe it's even being denied a loan for your business because you're a Christian-run business. Maybe, we know stories in the news about bakeries being sued for not designing wedding cakes for same-sex couples. And we also see the stories of how some judges are awarding massive amounts of money that basically bankrupt the company. Well, just as Jesus could have avoided the cross, either by most likely by denying God, these business owners have the same choice and the same opportunity to take up their cross or not. They could avoid this by compromising. But those who persevere are the ones who receive the word on good ground and not on the stony places. And in verse 7, Jesus talks about the thorns now. The thorns sprang up and choked them. And he says that means this is the person whose cares of the world and the deceitfulness of the riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. These are the ones who love their material goods more than their newfound faith. There is an opportunity to convert these people, but it is not easy. The task is to convince a person that living for God now is much more beneficial for them in the long run than enjoying all these things of this world. The convert has to buy into this process of greater returns in eternity than what he or she may enjoy now. We don't want to set them up for failure by not telling them that by becoming a Christian, the odds are that your lives are not going to be blessed with a lot of material goods and money. The last thing we want is for a flourishing young seed to be surprised at the first sight of thorns and have it be choked and killed. What we need to do is to encourage these new believers to avoid the traps and the snares of the enemy, and to have them built up in the midst of the congregation to become confident and strong believers. Jesus tells us that the ones that flourish will yield such a lucrative crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. In Jewish antiquity, the standard for a good crop was to yield 10-fold. In Genesis 26, God blessed Isaac so much that he yielded 100-fold on his crop. Now, although these numbers, I'm sure, aren't intended to be exact, in the parable, the representation is still very important. The worst crop that Jesus mentions is 3 times the standard. And Israel is not great farming ground. So imagine the excitement of Jesus' disciples whenever he told them that they would yield 100-fold crop. I want to leave you with this morning. There are countless opportunities to affect the lives out in the world for Christ. And in the church is most likely where we're not going to find the people without faith. We find them out in the world. We find them at work or at the grocery store or at the doctor's office. And when we find a person who feels drawn to God, someone who responds to your discussion with them about who Jesus Christ is, our prayer is that, armed with the understanding of the different types of soil that Jesus teaches about, and with the knowledge of the threats that are posed to these soils, we can actively work to shape each person into a mature believer. I want to emphasize it is not about growing numbers for any specific church, this one included. Sure, it would be great to have every single seat filled every Sunday and have standing room only and have to add additional services. But again, this analysis we're looking at is for the Christian church as a whole. Look at the Great Commission. What's the first word in it? Is go. It's not as important to bring people back into a specific church as to go into the world and make disciples there. They will find their way to a church if they are the seed on good ground. There are still many opportunities because Jesus has not returned yet. But just as God didn't rest until the 7th day when his work was completed, we cannot rest either until our work is completed, and Jesus will tell us whenever he returns. Until then, we need to continue to take advantage of every opportunity that the Lord gives us to find and to disciple the lost.